What's up? Yeah, sure.
Okay. All right, good evening, everybody. Oh, that was quick. Thank you for coming out. My name is John Heckman, a.k.a. the Tattooed Historian. And welcome to the first Tattooed Historian Presents at the Garryowen Irish Pub. I'm very thankful that Garryowen took a chance on doing this because it's not too often you get to come to a great historical event in Gettysburg and you don't have to pay for it. So I want to do some free talks for everyone, and this is the first of at least 3 that are upcoming. So I will be giving out more information on that later. But the first talk this evening is going to be by Dr. Ian Isherwood. And he has, yes.
No, thanks, come
here. A man of tweed. He knows his history. And what can I say about him that's not already been said about Sean Connery, really? He would be a great 007. Right?
Well, I think I'd shoot myself.
Maybe not. Just so I get some of the things right about Ian. He is the assistant professor of War Memory Studies at Gettysburg College. He has got his PhD from the Scottish Centre for War Studies, University of Glasgow. Mm-hmm. Not Glasgow, Glasgow. Project creator of the First World War Letters of HJC or Jack Piers. It's a great digital history project if you all want to take a look at that. He's advisor at Tri Sigma, the Gettysburg College Journal of the Civil War Era, and the Barbecue Club. All right. Which is a gig I want. He's authored numerous articles, and he's also the author of Remembering the Great War. And I'm delighted to have my good friend Ian here for the first Tattooed Historian Presents the Garryowen Irish Pub. So please give it up for Ian.
Well, thank you, John. It was far too generous of an introduction. The reason I was waving was not because I wanted you to clap. It's because I saw people in the back, and I wanted them to come in. But it happened to be at an awkward moment, so I'm glad I've started off this evening in an awkward way. I've talked a lot of history in bars, but this is the first time that I've ever done it with an audience, other than 1 or 2 people who were kind of captive as being my friends. So this is a little bit of an unusual format for me. But I will endeavor to kind of try to say something remotely intelligent about the Centennial of the Great War. So I'm setting the standards pretty low for all of you. The format that I'd like to work with is for us to, for me, I'm going to talk for about 20 minutes or so, kind of giving some reflections over the last 4 years, giving some reflections over what the Centennial is, what the legacy of the Great War is. And then I'd be happy to field some official questions from all of you, but I do want to actually enjoy my pint at some point. So after we have some official questions, I'll definitely stick around for some unofficial banter as well. I can't believe so many people showed up to hear this. This is actually quite remarkable and quite surprising. So maybe what I'm going to say about the First World War being forgotten is not actually true. So maybe I'm wrong right off the bat. So the Centennial of the Great War is approaching its official ending, and that will be on the 11th of November, 2018. Of course, the war didn't end exactly on the 11th of November, 1918. It did with subsequent peace settlements that happened in the next year, and of course, the war continued in Central and Eastern Europe, in the Middle East, where violence continued after the war afterwards. So we shouldn't necessarily think of November 11th as being the end of the war. I think that we should look at kind of a more fluid definition of what happens during the Great War is then leading to more violence that continues afterward and well into the early 1920s. That being said, we have to pick a date for the Centennial of the Great War to end, right? So that date is probably going to be the 11th of November, 2018. And the date is significant because it's the date in which an armistice is signed on the Western Front. I'll talk about what that armistice is in just a few minutes. And we, as a collective, we will be commemorating this kind of great event when the guns fell silent in 2 months' time. Now, commemorations are an opportunity for us to reflect upon the legacy of conflicts. And what that means is how we look at the event that happens in the past and how we understand that event within the present. And for all of you who lived through the 150th anniversary of the Civil War here in Gettysburg, and I know some of you, I think I saw John Heiser here. John knows an awful lot about this, right? Living through the 150th here in Gettysburg. If you lived through that event, what you saw was kind of a dialogue that was happening within historically conscious people, with public historians and academic historians who were all trying to understand kind of how we reevaluate the way in which we look at a very big and traumatic event within a wider national dialogue. So the anniversary of the armistice is, of course, an opportunity for this, or it should be an opportunity for this, and I'll talk at the end about whether it is going to be an opportunity for this. First, I want to talk a little bit about history, and that is 100 years ago this week, Allied armies were engaged in the midst of the 100 Days Campaign, which is a war-winning campaign on the Western Front, which will eventually lead to a decisive outcome there. Next week, in fact, we commemorate the anniversary of the start of the Meuse-Argonne campaign, which is the largest battle waged by the United States Army, in which we see 1 million men who were in that section of France and 120,000 casualties for U.S. forces at the Meuse-Argonne. The combined Allied offensives of 1918 led to eventually the breaking of the Hindenburg Line of defenses and the disintegration of the German army. And that last point can't be stressed enough. The German army, by October of 1918, certainly had quite a bit of fight left in it, but it was a demoralized fighting force, with high desertion rates, with low combat motivation. Even worse, the general staff of the German army was increasingly found the strategic situation on the Western Front to be hopeless. The writing seemed to be on the wall in October and early November of 1918, and the writing on the wall was in very large print in one word: defeat. The armistice then was negotiated between representatives of the German government at Compiègne, Matthias Erzberger being one of them, representing the German government, who signed the armistice along with Marshal Ferdinand Foch, who represented the Allies. And at 11 a.m., so the bedtime story ends, the guns fell silent, the German army defeated on the Western Front. Now, what's interesting is that this news on the Western Front was met by many with a sense of resignation. Some, of course, celebrated. Many old veterans were resigned to it, and some were confused by what an armistice actually was. Medal of Honor winner John Barclay from the AEF saw a soldier coming down the street, and he was telling everyone, an armistice has been signed, an armistice has been signed. And Barclay was perplexed by the word. He said, "What's an armistice? It sounded like some kind of machine to me." A medical officer of the Royal Welsh Fusiliers, a man by the name Dr. J.C. Dunn, he recalled that the news, quote, felt somewhat flat. The event was an anticlimax. It revealed by some spasmodic cheering when the news got about, by a general atmosphere of slacking off for a day. So these are men who had fought a long campaign and saw an armistice as an opportunity to finally get some rest. One of Dunn's fellow officers recalled, "To me, the most remarkable feature of the day and night was the uncanny silence which prevailed. No rumbling of guns, no staccato of machine guns. The war was over." To the future historian Guy Chapman, and some of you have taken my classes and heard an awful lot of Guy Chapman in your time, the armistice was greeted with a weary pause. Men were too tired to actually celebrate. Guy Chapman recalled, "At 11 o'clock, we slung on our packs and we trampled along the muddy pavement. The band played, but there was very little singing. We were very old, we were very tired, and now very wise." Chapman was only 29 years old when he recalled that. For Lieutenant Colonel H.J.C. Peers, which we have a digital history project for, www.jackpeers, irs.org, which was founded by my colleagues Amy Lucadamo, R.C. Miesler, and myself, who created the website, so definitely check out the project. When Lieutenant Colonel Pears, when Pears heard the news of the armistice, he wrote home to his father with a superb understatement and resignation for which he was known, beginning his letter, "So that's that." The war's ending for those who waged it, and this is kind of my broader point, for those who had suffered, for those who adapted to the front, for those who endured and learned to carry on despite the horrific conditions in which they were fighting. This was a moment of weary contemplation. It was a moment of relief. It was a moment of both great hope and great anxiety about what would come next. And especially think about this if you are a young person going off to war in 1914 or 15, and if you survive through 3 years of war, your life is only beginning after having lived through that experience, that hell of the Western Front. Of course, with the armistice itself, the war passed into memory. And the next battles that were waged by the war generation were in part about what the sacrifice they went through meant on a broader scale. That sacrifice was extensive. The war left millions of people grieving, of families, of sisters and brothers, of wives and loved ones. 10 million men, at least in uniform, died. 20 million plus suffered grievous war wounds. Civilian deaths are complicated for historians to calculate, but we know that millions of civilians too died during the war of famine, of results of displacement, and of ethnic cleansing. How did people who lived through this carnage and this trauma, how did they justify the conflict that they went through? More generally, how did they make sense of the existential violence in which they had witnessed? These are impossible questions for historians to answer. That doesn't mean you can't write term papers on them. Please do. But they are impossible questions to answer if you examine the sources. Each person who was in the war or lived through it was affected by it and felt it in a different way. But over time, societies that went through the war, they developed their own impressions about what happened. The grieved oftentimes felt their losses in terms of silence. You oftentimes hear this in the 20s and 30s of the war generation be silent. Indeed, you hear this of the World War II generation, the Vietnam generation, of people coming back from war and being silent, of course. Soldiers and those who lived through the war also, though, were not silent. They wrote in abundance on the war's causes, on its conduct, and on its consequences. They debated campaigns when they got together in old comrades clubs or in legion halls. They built monuments and memorials to fallen chums and comrades. So the question of how the war would be remembered was one that came as a great creative opportunity, but also a burden to those who survived the war. The desire to commemorate the victory was initially very appealing. Certainly, monuments and memorials reflecting this came into being in the 1920s and the 1930s. But as the 1920s went on, the prevailing sense was one of tragedy, of commemorating the fallen, a cult of death en masse, informing the public on the tragic nature of the war at the same time in which nations were facing economic volatility and political extremism. But the emphasis remained on the fallen, and I would argue that the emphasis has remained since on the fallen. In 1927, Field Marshal Lord Plumer, British Army General, a Field Marshal, dedicated the Menin Gate. Has anybody ever been to the Menin Gate at Ypres? It's a huge, enormous monument to the lost that fought in Belgium. And Field Marshal Lord Plumer, he dedicates this massive arched monument at Ypres. He dedicated it with the names of 59,000 men cut into stone within the monument itself, These are the names of men who had no known graves from that sector of the front line. When Plummer got up, he had a simple message for people. He said to a crowd in front of him of veterans and of families of veterans, he said of those unidentified men, "He is not missing, he is here." One veteran who was there and saw what Lord Plummer had to say wrote his own reflection on it. His name was Charles Dowie, who went off to war at 19 years of age, and then later on wrote a war memoir called The Weary Road. Dowie wrote, "We have a voice, we who are left, for we have but to name our friends, and the memories with which their names evoke are more eloquent than poetry. But there is no voice which can tell our story to those who come after us. The men who might have had that power are dead. Their voices are stilled forever. Lord Plummer is right. He is not missing. He is here. But he is here only so long as his memory rests in the minds of those who were intimate with him, whether in home or on the battlefield. When the generation who fought the war is dead, much will perish, which will be of value to those who come after us." More locally for us, on November 11th, 1920, the memorial tablet to the fallen at Adams County was dedicated on the Adams County Courthouse. And it was unveiled with speeches, with prayers, and dedications. Similar to the words of Charles Dowie, one American Expeditionary Force veteran, a man by the name of Percy Eichelberger, a great central Pennsylvania name, Percy Eichelberger, who himself was a veteran of the AEF, and he was the first commander of the local Legion post, he said during the dedication, "In the first place, this tablet represents great sacrifices. Sacrifices so great they cannot be computed. In the next place, this tablet we dedicate is not a tablet representing sorrow. It is a memorial of honor. In honor of mothers who bade their sons to do brave deeds, in honor of wives who wept for husbands who should never come home again, in honor of children whose heritage is their fallen father's name, in honor of men who counted their lives dear when their country needed them." Both Charles Dowie and Percy Eichelberger, of course, separated by an ocean and separated by the armies in which they fought. But they call to mind similar sentiments. And this sentiment is reflected in one of the war's most well-known poems, in which I took the title of this talk from. It's For the Fallen by Robert Binion. It was composed in 1914. It's actually before the war entered some of its more brutal phases. And it's recited, this poem's recited every night at the Menin Gate at Ypres at 8 p.m. after the last post. And the final stanza reads, "They shall grow not old, as we that are left grow old. Age shall not weary them, nor the years condemn. At the going down of the sun and in the morning, we will remember them." For the war generation themselves, they understood two things that were not mutually exclusive. The war was the great event of their young lives. It was worthy of commemoration, and it was worthy for the acknowledgement of their heroic comrades. But also, they knew that the war was physically and emotionally a Pyrrhic victory for those who fought it on the Allied side. It was undeniably tragic, but that did not mean it was futile. On a more intimate and personal level, it meant you could be proud of your service and venerate your lost comrades while also being haunted by your memories. To remember the war brought out the complexities of traumatic memories and filtered them through a social act of remembrance. For the war generation, their lives were lived within this balance afterwards. Now, in my remaining few minutes, I want to talk about the notion of what all of this means, what the war generation thought about the war, and how that carries over into the legacy of the Great War for the Centennial. Legacies, as we all know, are complicated, which is like the great understatement of the evening. They take the past, they take an event from the past and they filter it through decades of history, decades of understanding, until we have to reinterpret that the meaning of that event in the present. And it's a very complicated thing to do. And in the process, a lot of meanings are altered, of course, and within the process, a lot of meanings change. The Great War obviously had a very complicated legacy. Yet no one could argue in the post-war period that it was irrelevant or it did not impact the course of history. You have the large number of deaths, of course, which are tantamount to kind of that idea of the war's importance. Oftentimes we measure the importance of war and deaths. We shouldn't do it, but we do it. We still do it the same. The war was destabilizing of existing political orders. It destroyed old empires. It also exposed the fault lines of those old empires. And socially, politically, and economically, the war itself would contribute to another world war. These are all things that are a part of its complicated legacy. Yet now looking at the Centennial, I'm not sure how much of the common perceptions of the war have changed that much in the last 4 years. That's not because of a lack of effort. World War I scholars, Heckman's been doing this. If I'm asked to talk anywhere, I will come and talk about it. World War I scholars have been very busy in publishing their work and speaking when asked to speak, and local committees and individuals and digital projects have sprouted up in abundance for the Centennial of the Great War. In particular, in the United Kingdom, in Canada, in New Zealand, in Australia, there's been a significant emphasis on remembering the Great War. Yet, despite these good faith efforts, the war in the United States remains peripheral to our understanding of our history. The Centennial, I would argue, has not driven that ball forward that much. Now, one of the reasons for this, and this is a complicated notion. I was reading in advance for this talk. Yes, we do read in advance for our talks. I was reading up in advance for my talk. And I was reading a wonderful essay by Jennifer Keene, an amazing scholar, and she wrote a very good essay in a 2016 article on on the First World War being a forgotten war within the United States. And she writes something very complicated. It's a long article, so it's complicated, her argument. But she's got a great line at the end, in which she says that the European way of remembering the First World War, with its emphasis on mourning and its focus on grief, is one that is, quote, unacceptable within the United States, a society that privileges optimism and progress. It's an interesting concept, right? The war also is one that I would argue rests uneasily between, of course, two other great wars that are nearer to our sense of identity, the Civil War and the Second World War, which have their own mythologies but are essential wars for people understanding their own history within this country. I would argue also that the narrative arc of the war itself, meaning the arc of its history, the story of the war itself, is one that rests fundamentally uncomfortably with the public. This is part of the reason why historians see the First World War era as being such a fertile field for us to till, because its history is complicated and messy. But its causes itself are confusing for people to summarize. Its conduct, the way it's fought, is ruthless and it's dehumanizing. Its legacy itself from Versailles onwards is fraught. The war failed to end all wars, and in many ways, by failing to end all wars, it failed the test of summary history. Whatever the Great War was, it is not a tidy story, and it's not one where we can learn redemptive lessons. The failure to remember the war more widely is also because of the nature of the war itself, and that nature is not what a lot of people hope to get from their history. Thank you. Thank you. If anybody has any questions, let me know. I yelled myself hoarse.
Aw.
Wall.
Hi.
Hi.
So,
It's going to be a hard one.
What?
It's going to be a hard question. I know it.
So about grief in World War I and relating to the article that you are writing now, how does grief in World War I and how does America handle grief in World War I, or how does England handle grief in World War I compared to how America handled death of the Civil War? And I was just wondering if the concept of heroism changed at all between like the Victorian era and the Edwardian era.
What do you think of that question? It's a really good question, isn't it?
Can you repeat the question?
So the question itself has to do with the culture in the American Civil War, kind of the cult of grief within the American Civil War, and the same sort of cult of grief after the First World War in Europe specifically, and whether you can see kind of change in the nature of grief or the nature of heroism. I would say over time, right? That's kind of a good summary. So we tend to think, so this is a fun question because it's a deeply historiographical question, and that makes historians kind of jump up and down and do this sort of thing with their hands. So there's lots of ways of looking at it, of course, and history's messy, but for a long time historians of the Great War saw the Great War as kind of this great moment of cultural change, where everything changes as a result of the Great War. It leads to more kind of avant-garde literature, more avant-garde art. It fundamentally undermines kind of the existing Victorian order and replaces it with something else, right? There's been a lot of pushback against that argument, arguing that the forces of continuity are equally important in the interwar period and beyond. So people have still found great comfort in religion in terms of helping them through the grief after the First World War. People still, in many ways, created a cult of the fallen that would be very akin to people after the American Civil War. So I don't think that we can say that the Great War completely changes the nature of grief, right? The Great War, though, does change certain things. And one of the things I think that it changes is that, and Civil War historians will probably ding me for saying this, right, is that you see definitely a culture of grief, but you see in the monumentation of a lot of Civil War memorials and monuments definitely a more overt form of heroism that you would see in later monuments after the First World War. The monuments after the First World War, largely in towns and communities in France and in Britain, are pretty simple affairs. They're a cross, they're a roll of honor, they're a solitary and sad-looking soldier, right? Now that's not to say there aren't those kind of monuments to the American Civil War, but that after the Great War you see much more of an emphasis, I would say, on death. The changing nature of the heroism, I'm going to separate from that just a little bit. I'm not going to spend too much time answering the first question, which is an amateur thing to do, but I will say the nature of heroism during the Great War, of course, does change. Industrialized slaughter changes the way in which people view heroic action. If you're in a trench, and if you can't overtly act in a heroic way, you view heroism as being something as simple as survival, as enduring, as carrying on. And lots of Civil War soldiers, too, felt that way as well, but that's not as much of the narrative in which we've inherited since then. Though I know some Civil War scholars are working on that. So, yeah. Yep.
Why do you think it's taken so long to commemorate World War I? I mean, there was no 50th commemoration, there was no 75th. Even now, they're only coming up with a World War I memorial in Washington, in Percy Park. I mean, why do you think that it just got swept into the bin of memory? I mean, that the American people never really, I mean, World War II or Vietnam, it's just...
So, another fantastic question, okay? Why has it taken so long to remember the First World War in the United States? It's a very good question. The way that I would argue it is that we did remember the First World War in the 1920s and the 1930s. But then with the Second World War, that very quickly changed the nature of the first. And I'll give you a few examples. In a lot of towns that you know, there is a doughboy statue, or there is a public space that is dedicated to a World War I battle, or there's a public building that's named for the Allies, or that's named even after like someone like General Pershing, or there's a street named General Pershing. After the war, there's a huge wave of memorialization in the United States, and its emphasis is on two things. Monuments that look very similar to Civil War monuments of kind of a soldier, a heroic depiction of a soldier, or what they called living memorials, which are big parks or public buildings or libraries in which you could find some use for other than just gathering there during a public event. And they're all over the place. Is anyone here from Baltimore? Yeah? There's a huge war memorial in Baltimore. It's this huge Greco-Roman building, and it's enormous, and it has an eternal lamp inside of it. It's got the divisions of the AEF and all of their battles carved in stone. The ceiling's like a gazillion feet tall, right? It's this huge building, and it was the cornerstone was laid by First World War generals, and it had a huge public unveiling. So these monuments are around, and I'm from Pittsburgh. The Boulevard of the, in case you didn't know, I'm from Pittsburgh. The Boulevard of the Allies in Pittsburgh was a road that was built to commemorate victory of the First World War. So roads are around, monuments are around. But the 1930s was a difficult time for a lot of reasons within the United States, a particularly difficult time for First World War veterans in light of the bonus march, in light of how veterans were treated afterward. So in many, and of course Treaty of Versailles fits in with this, but after the Second World War, I think it changes the nature of the First. And First World War, very much, those spaces have been forgotten. So that's a very good question.
How do countries like the French or the British remember their colonial soldiers who fought in the war?
Well, I mean that's an excellent question. Mostly in terms of monuments in France. So mostly in terms of monuments in France, and there are monuments in former colonial nations as well. But that memory actually has been revisited significantly within the Centennial. There have been people pushing for more recognition of the contribution of colonial soldiers. If we expand the definition of colonial soldiers to Dominion soldiers, then I would say there's been great emphasis on memorializing and honoring the contributions of Anzac forces, of Canadian forces, and South African forces. There's a huge South African monument at Delville Wood, for example. So that partly answers your question. Yep.
So we were talking about the effects of World War I on different countries, the way different countries grieve. And in particular, I teach Holocaust literature.
Right.
So I'm thinking about this in the context of post-World War I Germany.
Yeah.
And how different was that from other countries in Europe and around the world that were involved?
Yeah, so you're actually hitting me in an area that's outside of my expertise, okay. And this is being filmed, so I don't want to necessarily say something that's a little silly. There was an effort in Germany to memorialize the war. It's complicated by social revolution. It's complicated by economic and political volatility within the 1920s. But then with fascism in the 1930s, it of course changes the definition of kind of the way in which war memory is playing out. And there's a good book called Fallen Soldiers by George Moss about the notion of the cult of soldiers, the cult of the front that develops within kind of right-wing German circles, and it fits into the way in which Germans are remembering the war. Jay Winter's also written some stuff on German monuments, so I'm going to name the names of other people.
Totally fine.
And Stefan Goebel has a very good book as well on the Great War in medieval memory, in which he dedicates a significant portion to Germany. So I'll hit you with a reading list.
Okay.
So.
I like it.
Yep.
Can you talk just for a moment about the Gettysburg contribution with Camp Colt being located here?
Yeah. So the questions about Gettysburg and Camp Colt and the contribution of Gettysburg. So one of the ways that I would look at kind of Adams County during the war itself is that the mobilization camp in 1917 and Camp Colt in 1918 are really the big story of the war here in Adams County, right? The mobilization camp in 1917 is a military camp that's on the site of the battlefield. That's then expanded into Camp Colt within 1918, the birthplace of the Tank Corps. Leads to all kinds of friction with locals. Mark Snell has recently written a book on this. So it leads to all kinds of friction with the locals. But one thing that I would say is if we expand the definition and look at the First World War as a global event, in 1914, during the outbreak of war, if you look at the Gettysburg Times, you will see stories in which people are worried about the war's impact on Adams County. Something like 80% of the dehydrated apples that were harvested in Adams County were shipped to Germany, and those shipments stopped with the British blockade. So there's an economic impact here within Adams County, but then there were people in town who were knitting for Belgian relief organizations as the war was ongoing. There was a local Red Cross chapter that became very active as the war went on, and the preparedness movement engulfed Pennsylvania College, where young men at Pennsylvania College went off to Plattsburgh to get some military training before they went off to fight the Kaiser. So when we talk about impact within Adams County, the two mobilization camps get most of the attention, but people locally are paying attention to what's going on in the war from 1914 onwards. Yep.
Do you feel there's any differences or similarities between how countries involved in the Western Front remember the war versus countries like the Italian Front and the Ottoman Empire?
Yeah, I mean, both of those, I'm also going to fall back on the fact that they're mostly outside of my scope of expertise, but but each nation is reacting to the war differently. And one thing I will say is that although the Great War is seen in a particular way in France, in Britain, and in the United States, for nations like Italy and for nations like Turkey, the Ottoman Empire ceases to exist, but Turkey becomes a nation in its own right. The memory of the war is very different because of what happens afterward. So in a state like Turkey, there's a war that's fought afterward of independence, of nation creation, right? And so the war is thought about very, very differently there. And the same thing with Italy because of the 1920s and the 1930s, right? In which fascism is certainly part of the narrative of the early commemoration of the war. That's really all I can say about that. So.
There was a great article in Smithsonian last year about Gallipoli and how Turkey and the Anzac countries have kind of joined together to make it a place of reconciliation.
Yeah.
As opposed to honoring the Turks.
Yeah. Gallipoli itself is a great example of that. It's a site of tourism for people from Australia and New Zealand, but it very much is a site of reconciliation now, and that's an interesting facet. Yep.
Out of sort of the monuments and memorials you studied, is there one in particular that you think really sums up the spirit of the veterans or the generation coming afterwards?
Yeah, that's a hard one. That's hard. So is there a monument I think sums up feelings of veterans or the generations coming afterward? It's so hard because it's nation specific and people felt all kinds of things after the war. the people that I study are mostly people that write about the war, and the reason they're writing about the war is so they can have, for most of them, some of them it's to sell books and to make some money, but some of them it's because they want a sense of agency. They want a sense of laying down their contribution to the memory of the war or the history of the war. I'm going to change the question. I'm going to pull a politician's trick, and I'm going to change the question. And I'm going to say that the monument that consistently moves me 2 tiers, which then are quickly stifled, is the Scottish War Memorial in Edinburgh Castle. It's an amazing war memorial. It's Gothic, but you go in, and it represents all of the regiments and all of the people who died from that small nation. And it's incredibly moving. But also, I will put a plug in for my alma mater at the university, my other alma mater, at the University of Glasgow. Their chapel was dedicated as a memorial to the fallen of the university in 1929. And when you walk in the chapel, staring you right in the face, behind the altar, in gold, are the names of the sons of the university who died in the war. And the names are big, and you can't miss them, and they're there, and on the side are people who died in the Second War. So it's incredibly moving. Those kind of spaces really hit home kind of how the war affected a small community of people. And those are the memorials that I find very impactful. But to each their own, right? So, Laura.
So thinking about memory and the way that memory is shaped, what changes have you seen in the way this war is memorialized more recently, even over the past
Yeah, that's tough. I mean, there's been a number of memorials that have been dedicated on the Western Front within the last 20 years. They're all, I mean, they're all different, of course, but I mean, I'm trying to think of an example in which it shows the evolution of war memory. I would say probably the new American memorial that's been proposed is the most kind of the most different one that I've seen. And for those of you who haven't seen it, like Google the designs and have a look at them. It's an interesting monument because it's connecting a lot of different things. It's kind of connecting World War I archetypes with then putting them on sort of like a wall, like a grieving wall. And if you look at some of the stuff that people were making in the 1920s and 1930s in terms of American war monuments, they're pretty heroic war monuments. Like, they are not overwhelmingly tragic monuments. So, but again, it's all about reception. So when I see the monument, I think I'll probably have a different opinion about it. But yeah, I mean, I can't really chart like that there's a significant difference. But if anybody wants to work on a doctoral dissertation on the topic, that sounds like a perfect one. So I'm dodging a lot of questions, as you can see. Also getting really hot. I shouldn't have worn a suit. Yes?
You talk about this cult of the front that emerges in German political culture.
Yeah.
Do you see something similar emerging in Great Britain or any of the other allied nations like Russia?
I mean, you see, the front generation's important, I think, in all of those nations, but it has a different meaning within fascism. And there's Moss's book is quite good on this subject, but there's another comparative work by a woman by the name of Deborah Cohen. It's a really good book, and in it she examines soldiers' pensions and political radicalization in Britain and in Germany. So she's actually doing a bit of economic history, but then she's doing a bit of social history and seeing how veteran demographics are reacting after the war. And what she found is that soldiers in Germany former soldiers, veterans, received very generous pension packages, but they were more likely to become extremists against the state. Where in Britain, veterans received very poor pensions in comparison, but were more likely to be kind of status quo or complacent. So they didn't become revolutionaries against the state. Now this sounds like an interesting kind of argument if you think about it, but then she also says that in Britain, people are receiving little money from the government for pensions, but they're receiving a lot of aid from community groups and from concerned citizens, which means that veterans feel more a part of their local communities than in Germany. So veterans overwhelmingly in a place like Britain, they don't join the British Legion en masse, they don't join old soldiers clubs, they in many ways want the war to be over, right? And it's kind of a large group. You can't say that about everybody, but kind of as a demographic, that's the case. Where in Germany, that's not the case either. And I think the big thing that's hanging over all of our heads with the question is the culture of defeat. How defeat creates new justifications, new political realities, new ways of looking at the state. And I'm not going to make the direct comparison, but I will say that in defeat, you have a new mythology in the American Civil War of the lost cause, which becomes political vindication of the South after the war. And in Germany, in defeat, you have all kinds of legends that also spring up. The stab in the back myth is kind of the big one, but these spring up and are very popular with veterans. Now, saying this on camera, it's not a direct link. They're not the same thing, okay? But cultures of defeat produce their own mythologies, and those mythologies are oftentimes about vindication. I just was writing something about this. Thank you for asking the question.
Yeah, great job.
All right.
All right, everybody, I'm seeing a lot of empty glasses, and as a guy who used to drink and it's hot up here, I know a lot of you need to have a drink. So let's thank Dr. Ian Isherwood for his...
Thank you.